He laid a single wrinkled dollar on the splintered auction table for a tractor so eaten by rust it looked like a dead animal, half buried in the red Oklahoma dust. The auctioneer smirked, the crowd cackled, and somebody yelled that Jake Wheeler had just bought himself 40,000 pounds of bad luck. He hauled the 1919 Liberty Steam Titan home anyway, chains creaking as the flatbed swayed, evening sun bleeding across its rotted boiler like dried blood. He parked it beside his collapsing barn, telling himself it would be nothing more than a memorial to a farm already halfway in the grave. For 2 days, he scraped, brushed, and chipped, chasing memories more than shine. On the third, his wrench tapped the firebox door. It did not ring. It thudded, heavy, wrong. As if the heart of the machine had been filled on purpose and then welded shut by hands that expected never to be found, curiosity should have died there. Instead, Jake fetched a crowbar, a grinder, and his last working flashlight. Sparks flew in the dark barn, painting the rafters orange. When the seal finally gave with a screaming crack, air rushed out that hadn't moved since Woodrow Wilson sat in the White House. The beam found canvas-wrapped bricks, jammed behind a false steel wall, stamps barely visible through soot. They weren't junk. They were gold bars, thick, old, stamped with an eagle and a date that did not match any story the government ever told. Beside them lay folders sealed with rotted red wax and a faded War Department crest. By sunrise, Jake understood he hadn't rescued a relic. He'd opened a vault. And whatever this tractor had been hiding for 100 years had just started looking for him back. Down the road, someone was watching. Jake Wheeler's land looked tired long before the rain gave up on it. From the mailbox at the edge of the county road all the way to the crooked fence line, the Oklahoma panhandle stretched out in a patchwork of dust, dead grass, and cracked clay that gaped like old scars. Every step toward the farmhouse kicked up powder that used to be soil. The wind no longer carried the smell of alfalfa or wet earth, only grit that stuck in his teeth and a dryness that lived permanently at the back of his throat. Most mornings, he stood on the warped porch boards with a chipped mug of coffee and watched the horizon as if sheer stubbornness could pull clouds across that empty sky. Rusted irrigation pipe lay half buried along the field, a reminder of seasons when the wells still had something to give. Now the pivots were statues, frozen in place, arms stretched out over nothing. The few cows he had left wandered between thorny tufts, ribs visible beneath faded hides, tails flicking at flies that refused to go elsewhere. The house behind him felt bigger since Ellen died, not in square feet, but in echoes. Every sound bounced: a cabinet door, the tick of the kitchen clock, the slow wheeze of the refrigerator that should have been replaced years earlier. All of it seemed louder because her laughter wasn't there to swallow anything. Once upon a time, there had been music, radio low, while she mixed cornbread, humming under her breath, sock feet sliding on linoleum. Now the kitchen smelled mostly of coffee and dust. And Jake avoided looking at the spot where her apron still hung, pale yellow, untouched. Ellen had been gone 15 months, 3 days, and several eternities. Cancer had taken her fast at the end, slower at the start, one appointment at a time, one hope at a time. Hospitals had eaten what little savings they had. Funeral costs ate the rest. After she was lowered into the red dirt under a wind-twisted cedar, the mailbox started filling with things that looked like promises but read like threats. Past due, final notice, intent to collect, credit card bills, medical statements, feed invoices, property tax reminders with official seals that meant nothing to the sky above his fields. Jake stacked envelopes on the kitchen table for a while, telling himself he would open them when he felt stronger, when harvest came. When the next rain fell, harvest never came. Rain forgot the root. Strength turned out to be a luxury he couldn't afford. Eventually, he started opening them just to know which wolves were closest to the door. Numbers marched across the pages in columns that made his eyes ache. Interest, penalties, balances rolling forward like a dust storm he couldn't outrun. He tried selling off equipment, piece by piece. The haybine went first, then an old pickup, then a pair of trailers. He canceled internet, cut back on satellite television, switched to the cheap feed that the co-op clerk warned him wouldn't keep weight on the herd. He did the math on paper anyway, pencil digging into the margin, and still came up short. At night the house settled around him, with small pops and groans that sounded almost like complaints. "You were supposed to fix us," the board seemed to say. "You were supposed to keep her here." The worst time of day was late afternoon, when the light slanted through the western windows just the way Ellen liked. She used to stop whatever she was doing and stand there, hands on hips, watching dust dance in the beams, as if the world were made of gold powder waiting to be scooped up. Jake still caught himself turning to call her name when that light hit, ready to make some small joke about the sky, finally remembering them. Then the memory arrived before the words, and he swallowed everything down with a taste like rust. He talked less, even to himself. The dog they'd had for 13 years had followed Ellen into the ground 1 month after the funeral, lying down on the back porch and never standing again. Without that soft padding of paws, the house felt like a museum. Rooms full of objects that belonged to a life that had ended. On the mantel, a photo from their first year on the farm showed them younger, sunburned, grinning, standing beside a brand-new green tractor. The tractor was gone now, traded to cover one hospital bill. The grin on his own face looked like it belonged to somebody he might have known once. Mail still came. Flyers, catalogs, odd junk with bright colors that didn't belong in a place so faded. One Wednesday, with the sky the exact color of old dishwater, he trudged down the drive to the rusted mailbox and pulled out the usual stack. Bills, a thin sympathy card from a cousin who had waited too long, and a folded newspaper from 3 towns over that he hadn't subscribed to. He almost tossed it into the burn barrel out of habit, but a black and white picture caught his eye. It was a grainy photo of a salvage yard and a row of machines lined up like exhausted soldiers. Combines, pickups, balers, and at the edge of the frame, a hulking shape with iron wheels half sunk in weeds. Above it, bold letters shouted, "Farm liquidation, auction, everything must go. Dates, directions, terms." "Old iron," said the caption. "Historic equipment, all must sell." Jake turned the page with fingers stained by oil and dust, scanning lines he would have skipped any other year. There was no reason to waste diesel driving to watch strangers bid on the last bones of some other farmer's dreams. Yet something about that hulking silhouette under the headline tugged at him. Maybe it was stubborn curiosity. Maybe just the excuse to be around voices for a few hours that didn't echo off his own kitchen walls. He laid the paper on the table beside the stack of unpaid notices and stared at both until the coffee cooled. On unaffordable white sheets, numbers tried to tell him everything that was already broken. On cheap newsprint, black ink whispered about a yard full of ghosts with engines. Somewhere between them, an idea took shape. Small, foolish, and oddly comforting. If the land was going to die on him, maybe he could at least drag home one last relic to stand guard while it did. That night he circled the auction date with the stub of a pencil, the line carving deeper than the paper deserved, and pinned the notice to the refrigerator door with a magnet from a feed store that had closed years before. The house said nothing. The fields outside lay silent under a sky that refused rain. In that quiet, the decision felt less like escape and more like momentum. He would drive out there. He would stand among strangers and rust, and whether he bought anything or not, for a few hours he wouldn't be alone with the sound of his own loss. Far from it, something was already shifting inside him. The auction yard sat behind a sagging chain-link fence on the edge of a town that was barely more than a gas station, a cafe, and a grain elevator that hadn't seen real traffic in years. Jake eased his pickup into a row of dusty trucks and farm rigs, killed the engine, and sat for a second, with both hands on the wheel. From here, he could already hear the crackle of the auctioneer's microphone, that rapid-fire chant, bouncing off sheet metal, rising and falling like some strange kind of music everyone pretended to understand. Laughter floated up every so often, sharp and brittle, followed by the hollow thud of boots on trailer decks, diesel fumes, fried food, and the sour tang of old oil met him as soon as he opened the door. Men in faded caps and women in worn boots milled around, poking at the last pieces of somebody else's life lined up in neat rows, hay rakes with missing teeth, combines stripped for parts, pickups with hoods propped open like jaws. Kids climbed on balers and got shooed off. A speaker wired to a bent pole spit static into the sky. Jake threaded through the mess, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, nodding at a few familiar faces who offered half-hearted greetings. Out here, everyone knew everybody's acreage and misfortunes, but nobody said much about them in public. They just looked, measured, and filed the information away. Near the back of the lot, beyond a row of sickly green tractors, he saw the silhouette from the newspaper photo, only bigger, heavier, more out of place than he expected. The Liberty Steam Titan sat half sunk in the dirt like a stranded ship, iron wheels swallowed to the spokes, boiler pitted and flaking. Tall grass grew through its gears. Birds had nested in the shadows of its flywheel. The front smokestack leaned at a tired angle, pointing into nothing. A faded dealer tag screwed to the side barely clung on, the lettering worn thin by too many summers. Up close, the thing radiated the stubborn dignity of something built for a different world. Jake reached out and touched the rim of one massive wheel. The metal felt rough, alive with a history that didn't care where he came from or how badly his fields had failed. He imagined men in suspenders and brimmed hats, clambering over this steel, feeding coal into its belly, dragging plows through virgin sod, back when rain still came on time and people believed effort alone could bend the land into kindness. Now the Titan was nothing but a curiosity sinking into weeds. A couple of younger guys wandered over, plastic cups in hand, and stared at the relic with amused smirks. "Look at that dinosaur," one of them said. "Needs a museum more than a farm. Probably weighs more than my whole place. Scrap at best." The other replied, "Bet you'd lose money just hauling it." They moved on when the loudspeaker crackled again and the crowd began to drift toward the center lanes, where a flatbed trailer served as a stage. The auctioneer, a long man with a sunburned neck and mirrored sunglasses, climbed up with a clipboard, flanked by a couple of ring men in bright shirts, who waved their hats like rodeo clowns. A portable generator hummed beside the trailer, powering the microphone and the deep fryer in the food truck that was doing brisk business in corn dogs and coffee. Jake stood at the edge of the crowd and watched as the sale rolled through the usual order. A welder went first, then a baler with a questionable knotter, then a pickup that needed more work than it was worth. Items rose and fell on the tide of bids, some sparking competitive flurries, others barely drawing a mutter. The auctioneer's chant slid over everything, fast, hypnotic, punctuated by the higher shouts of the spotters when they caught a nod or a hand twitch. Eventually, one of the ringmen pointed his hat toward the back of the yard, and the Titan's lot number crackled through the speakers. A loader rumbled to life, chains clanked, and with much coaxing and spinning tires, the old brute began to move, peeled reluctantly out of the weeds. A chorus of whistles and hoots greeted its appearance. Rust rained off in small flakes. The iron wheels left twin scars across the dirt lot as the loader dragged it into view near the trailer. "There she is, folks," the auctioneer drawled into the mic. "A piece of history right here. 1919 Liberty Steam Titan. As is, where is. No guarantees except she's heavy as sin. Who's brave enough to take her home?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted that the only place big enough for it was the junkyard. Another called out that it would make a fine lawn ornament for a crazy rich guy with too much time. Jake felt a faint sting at that, as if the joke had sliced close to whatever thought had dragged him here in the first place. The chant began. Numbers tossed into the air more as suggestion than expectation. Nobody raised a hand. The men who dealt in scrap watched with practiced calculation, weighing tonnage against hassle and fuel. The collectors shook their heads, seeing too much work even for bragging rights. The auctioneer dropped his starting price, then dropped it again, voice never losing rhythm, only the tone sharpening slightly as patience thinned. All right. I'm not married to it," he said finally. "Who'll give me $10 and take this old girl off our hands so we can all go home before dark? 10, 10, 10. Anybody at all?" Silence. A cough. A shifting of boots. Jake looked at the Titan, at the sun reflecting dull red off its boiler, and felt an impulse rise before he could name it. His fingers brushed the folded bills sitting in his pocket, the ones he had promised himself he wouldn't touch, except for gas and a burger on the way back. One single dollar might not save his farm. It wouldn't pay a fraction of what the power company wanted. It wouldn't pull Ellen back, but it could drag home one thing that didn't feel like surrender. He lifted his hand halfway, his throat dry. "One," he said louder than he meant to. "I'll give you $1. For a beat, nobody reacted. Then the line of the auctioneer's mouth twisted into a grin. "Got a man with $1, he announced, milking it. "One brave soul putting skin in the game. Do I hear two? $2? Anybody? Come on now. She's worth that just in stories for the grandkids." The yard erupted in laughter. Somebody behind Jake clapped him on the shoulder. Another voice called out, "Give it to him. He needs something to keep the tumbleweeds company." A few heads turned, recognizing the widower from the dry farm out past the county line, the one whose crops hadn't made it through the last 3 summers. Pity and amusement mixed freely on their faces. The auctioneer scanned the crowd, drawing out the moment, but nobody raised a hand, not even the scrap men, who knew the hassle of cutting a beast like that into manageable pieces. Finally, he shrugged in exaggerated defeat. "Well, folks, Looks like we found the only person in 3 counties crazy enough to want her, he said. Last call, last chance, $2. Anybody? No? Then sold, for the mighty sum of $1, to the gentleman right there. Sir, may your floorboards hold. Applause and laughter washed over Jake as the ring man pointed to him and scribbled his bidder number on the sheet. He felt his cheeks heat, but he managed a tight nod and a crooked half-smile. Embarrassment sat side by side with a strange flicker of pride. For the price of a soda, he now owned a machine that had outlived presidents and droughts, and the man who'd first signed the purchase papers. The loader operator climbed back into his cab and drove around to hook heavy chains to the Titan's frame. Metal groaned as decades of stubborn rest came to an end. Jake backed his pickup toward the hitching point, the old engine complaining but obeying. A chorus of good-natured jeers rose as the Liberty's wheels finally broke free of their earthen graves. Careful now, Wheeler. She'll drag you backwards to 1919. Wave if you need a tow truck for your tow truck. He set his jaw, checking the connections twice. The chains sang under tension. When he eased the truck into gear and feathered the clutch, the whole rig shuddered. For a second, he thought everything would snap. His bumper, the chains, his own thinning resolve. Then the Titan rolled, slow as a waking animal, leaving deep, parallel tracks behind. By the time he reached the main road, the sun had slunk low, turning the sky into a sheet of copper. Light poured across the fields, caught every jagged edge of rust, and made the old boiler glow the color of dried blood. In the rearview mirror, Jake watched the silhouette of the Liberty Steam Titan looming behind his pickup, its iron wheels bumping over ruts, its shadow stretching long across the dirt like the memory of some forgotten war. Wind roared past the half-open window, carrying dust and the faintest scent of rain somewhere far off, where it still remembered how to fall. As he turned down his own driveway, mailboxes and lone fence posts slipping by, it occurred to him that the farm had never seen anything quite like the beast trailing behind him. For the first time in a long while, the place wasn't just losing pieces, it was gaining something, even if it was rusty, useless, and heavy as regret. He eased to a stop beside the barn and killed the engine. The sudden quiet vacuumed the noise from his ears, leaving only the ticking of hot metal cooling and the creak of chains settling. The sun dipped lower, painting the Titan in red and shadow. Jake stepped out, boots crunching on the gravel, and stood there a moment, staring at the relic he'd just tied to his own sinking fortunes for the price of one battered bill. "Welcome home," he muttered, not sure if he meant it as a joke or as a blessing. The machine, of course, said nothing. But as the last light skimmed across its firebox door, the dull gleam that flashed back at him didn't look entirely like rust. Jake let the Titan sit a day or two like a big iron animal getting used to a new pasture. He walked around it with his morning coffee, boots crunching in the gravel, telling himself he'd start cleaning it tomorrow, the same way he'd been promising to fix fences, call the bank, patch the roof. On the third morning, the quiet in the kitchen felt louder than the auction crowd had, so he rinsed his mug, grabbed a bucket, and decided that if his farm was going to die, it could at least die with something worth looking at parked beside the barn. He dragged out a hose that leaked in 3 places, filled a dented bucket halfway, then dug through the shadows of the barn for an old wire brush and a rag that hadn't rotted completely through. Dust bloomed in the slanting light when he pulled boxes around. A coffee can labeled in Ellen's looping handwriting rattled full of bolts. He looked away fast, carried his gear outside, and set it at the Titan's flank. Up close, the old machine was even more brutal than it had looked at the auction. Boiler skin scabbed over with rust, rivets buried under layers of flaking paint, iron wheels fused to dirt. Jake climbed onto a low rung, set his feet, and dragged the brush across the panel nearest the cab. Rust came off in a shower, exposing dull steel the color of storm clouds. He repeated the motion, arm moving in slow, heavy arcs. Scrape, breath, scrape again. Pretty soon sweat trickled down his back despite the cool wind. Jays screamed in the cottonwoods by the dry creek bed. Somewhere a cow bawled at an empty water trough. The day shrank down to simple things: the rasp of bristles, the scrape of metal, the thud when he stepped down to shift the bucket. Working on the Titan hurt in a clean way, not like paperwork or memories. He moved along the boiler, loosening decades of decay, until he reached the square outline of the firebox door. It sat near the back, black with soot and patches of primer, handle frozen at a crooked angle. Jake scrubbed at the hinges until dull steel showed through, then wrapped his fingers around the grip and gave it a pull. Nothing. No rattle, no wobble, not even the grudging twitch you expect from a door that's just stiff. It felt solid, wrong. He frowned, set the brush on top of the boiler, and tapped the surface with his knuckles the way his father had taught him to check for thin metal on old tanks. Everywhere else on the boiler, the sound had come back as a hollow ring, a faint echo that said there was nothing inside but air, heat scars, and ghosts. Here, the knock returned as a dull, short thump, like hitting a buried rock. He shifted his hand and tried again. Same thick reply. No singing vibration. Nothing traveling along the shell. Just dead weight, inches under the skin. A small, sharp thrill slid under his ribs. Could be packed ash, he thought. Could be some farmer back in the 40s had poured sand in there to keep kids from playing with it. Could be anything that wasn't interesting. He told himself that twice, 3 times, the way you repeat, "It's probably nothing," when a doctor looks too long at an X-ray. Curiosity didn't listen. He climbed down, went back into the barn, and came out with a short-handled sledge. The head had nicks in it, from years of pounding fence posts and stubborn bolts. He tested the weight, then swung lightly at the edge of the door. Rust dust jumped, but the latch stayed put. He hit harder. A shiver ran through the frame, sending a puff of fine soot out of the seams and straight onto his boots. Coughing, eyes watering, he stepped back and wiped his face with his forearm. The taste of old ash sat bitter on his tongue. Behind that, underneath the char, there was another smell. Metal sealed too long, stale and sour, like the air that comes up when you open a cellar that hasn't seen light in decades. Jake dropped the hammer, grabbed a crowbar from the ground, and jammed the flat end into the tiny gap the blows had started at the hinge. He leaned into it with his whole weight. The firebox complained with a long, high screech that set his teeth on edge, but the door gave a fraction more. He rocked back and forth, prying, until the crack between steel and frame widened enough to slip 2 fingers through. Soot poured out in a gray stream, coating his hands, his shirt, the rungs under his boots. When his arms burned too much to push, he let the door hang half open and climbed down to fetch the flashlight from the truck. The plastic casing was scarred, the lens scratched, but it still worked most days if you smacked it. He slapped it against his palm until the beam jolted to life, weak and yellow in the afternoon sun. Back up on the rung, he wedged his shoulder against the sagging firebox door so it wouldn't swing shut and aimed the light into the dark. He'd expected to see cracked fire brick, maybe a rusted grate, hollow space where flames once chewed through coal. Instead, the beam splashed against a smooth, almost clean plate of steel set just a few inches beyond the opening. For a second, his brain refused to make sense of it. The metal inside lacked the rough scab of the outer shell. No brick pattern, no bending tubes, no gap. Just a second wall, faintly brighter, with a thin, even line running all the way around it, like a frame someone had tried to hide. He slid the light along the edges. No hinges, no bolts, no access panel. Whoever put it there hadn't planned on anyone coming back with a wrench to check their work. He reached out with the crowbar and tapped the plate. A sharp, compact sound came back, all punch, no echo. Not the hollow drum of an empty box, not the crumble of old masonry. Solid, heavy, intentional. Jake swallowed. His heart had been beating hard from the prying, but now it thudded in a different rhythm, tight and fast under his ribs. The little hairs along his arms rose despite the heat. He thought of the auctioneer joking about stories for the grandkids, of the way the scrap men had calculated weight and hassle, of the lonely drive back with this dead giant dragging behind his truck. He thought of every late-night rumor he'd ever half listened to at the co-op, about hidden liquor stills during Prohibition, outlaw cash stashed beneath floorboards, government shipments that never arrived after the war. Most of that talk was smoke. He knew it. This was probably some old farmer's harebrained idea of insulation or reinforcement. Yet, welds that clean didn't happen by accident out here, and men who built boilers for a living didn't wall off a firebox just for fun. He realized his breathing had gone shallow, each inhale catching halfway. The barnyard felt suddenly too quiet, as if the world were holding its breath along with him. No trucks on the county road, no distant tractor, just wind combing the dry grass and the faint tick of cooling metal. For the first time since Ellen died, Jake felt something twist inside him that wasn't grief or dread. It wasn't hope exactly, more like a hook, sharp, buried, tugging him forward. Behind that second skin of steel, there was something, maybe worthless, maybe dangerous, maybe nothing but old parts. But someone, long before his time, had cared enough to hide it where no one was supposed to look. His pulse hammered in his ears. He pressed the flashlight tighter in his fist, cleared his throat, and murmured to the empty barnyard without taking his eyes off that welded wall. "All right," he said, voice low, almost shaky. "Now you've got my attention." Jake didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that smooth inner plate, too perfect and solid, sitting where fire should have burned. By morning, he had decided whatever hid in that wall had waited a century. It didn't need another day of him staring at it. After coffee strong enough to bite, he pulled on his oldest jeans, grabbed the angle grinder from the pegboard, and dragged an extension cord across the yard toward the hulking titan. The sky over the Oklahoma panhandle looked like dull tin, the air still, as if the land itself were listening. He climbed onto the side rung, wedged his boots, and fed the cord through the half-open firebox door until it reached the welded plate. The grinder felt reassuring in his hands, work he understood better than bank letters. He checked the disc, braced his shoulders, and squeezed the trigger. The machine screamed awake. When the spinning wheel met the seam, sparks erupted in a tight fan, bouncing off the boiler and falling in bright arcs to the dirt. Hot steel smell flooded his throat. He cut slow, following the outline he had traced with the flashlight. Each pass bit deeper. Sweat slid down his back. Twice the grinder bound, as if something behind the plate were pushing back. He eased off, changed his angle, and kept going. Attention narrowed to the harsh grind and the rising heat under his gloves. When he finally finished the last side, he let the grinder spin down and listened to the sudden quiet. The new panel sagged, held only by a thin, uncut strip along the bottom. Jake wedged the crowbar into the gap, set his feet, and heaved. The welds shrieked. The plate buckled inward, and the false wall tore free with a long metallic groan. Something heavy shifted and slammed against the true back of the firebox with a flat, dense thud that belonged to nothing hollow. His heart punched his ribs. He grabbed the flashlight, thumb fumbling the switch, and shoved the beam into the opening. Light slid over torn steel, then landed on a tight stack of cloth-wrapped bricks, jammed where the wall had been. The bundles were uniform, corners sharp under stained canvas. Black ink bled through in patches, enough to show pieces of a stamp. U.S. Mint, the curve of an eagle. Jake reached in with shaking fingers and dragged the front package toward him. It resisted like a stubborn stone, heavier than it looked. He set it on the metal floor beside his boot, worried loose the rotten twine, and peeled the cloth away. Dull, yellow metal stared back at him. It didn't glitter like jewelry. It glowed, thick and calm. A bar of gold lay in his palm, longer than his hand, edges softened, face marked with numbers, an assay stamp, and under grime, a date, 1919. For a heartbeat, the barn, the dead fields, the debts, all fell away. There was only weight. His fingers tightened until his knuckles whitened. This was the kind of thing old men laughed about over coffee, not something you actually held on a Tuesday afternoon. He wrapped the bar back in its canvas skin and pushed it aside before his brain could start racing through crazy escape plans. The beam crawled deeper. Behind the bullion sat flatter bundles wrapped in oilcloth. He hauled one out, laid it next to the gold, and eased the cover back. Inside, weighted paper. Fragile but not dust. The top sheet bore a faded letterhead. War Department, Office of Transportation. Below, a manifest ran in tidy lines, crate numbers, weights, departure point, destination. Across the margin, in slanted ink, someone had written, Panhandle Transfer, Special Consignment. A note beneath read, Route altered per directive, do not enter in standard log. A circular seal stamped the bottom. United States, Gold Reserve. Jake turned the page carefully. The next sheet listed contents by crate, bullion, bars, coin bags, all dated 1919. A narrow column on the edge carried a single word repeated beside several entries. Lost. Each of those marks was underlined twice. Cool prickling climbed his neck. This was not forgotten scrap. This was cargo that, on paper, had vanished between a rail yard and a vault. Instead, it had been bricked into the gut of a tractor and rolled out into nowhere to sit under his sky for 100 years. He thumbed through the rest of the folder. There were letters demanding explanations, replies full of foggy phrases, and one hard memo with whole blocks blacked out. A brittle envelope at the back held a photograph. Soldiers lined beside a loaded flat car, faces caught between pride and nerves. On the back, in pencil, someone had written, Last stop before the Panhandle. Nobody talks. He sat there on the iron step a long moment, elbows on his knees, the photograph sagging between his fingers. Dust motes drifted in the beam from the open barn door, turning lazy circles over the bar of gold at his boot. Those men in the picture were probably buried in neat military rows or forgotten graveyards. Yet, the decision they helped hide was breathing again in his yard. Jake thought of every night he had lain awake, counting the ways his luck had failed, and a bitter, disbelieving laugh scraped out of his throat. All this time, he had been begging the sky for rain, and instead, it had sent him a century-old crime scene disguised as junk right on his own land. Jake looked from the photo to the gold bar, to the dark mouth of the firebox. The Titan no longer felt like yard art. It felt like a safe on wheels that had finally, grudgingly, cracked open. Out by the fence, a cow flicked its tail. Somewhere on the county road, a truck droned past and faded. The yard itself seemed to lean in. For years, life had only taken from him Ellen, rain, cattle, courage, every number on every bill that refused to bend. Now it had shoved something wild into his arms, wrapped in history and risk. He could almost hear Ellen saying his name the way she did when trouble and opportunity arrived in the same package. Gold like this did not go missing quietly. Manifests stamped, "Lost" did not sit on a farmer's floor without drawing eyes once someone noticed. Whoever had ordered this cargo diverted had worn uniforms, signed forms, and trusted rust, distance, and time to bury the trail. That trust had just been broken by a man with a grinder and nothing left to lose. The Titan was not junk. It was a vault filled with someone else's secret, parked on his dying farm. Whatever choice he made next would not just change his bank balance. It would decide who started looking down his dirt road at night. His pulse roared in his ears. The gold bar beside his boot waited, mute and heavy, like a test. If you ever felt life kicked you when you were already down, hit like right now, because what Jake did next took real guts. Jake told no one that first day. He wrapped each bar in stained canvas, stacked the bundles and the War Department folder in an old army trunk from the attic, and snapped a padlock through the hasp. The trunk went behind Ellen's winter coats in the bedroom closet, buried under hanging wool that still carried her faint perfume. Outside, he swung the firebox door shut and smeared soot along the cut seam until it looked like another crack on a dead tractor. From the county road, the Liberty Titan was nothing but rusted yard art again. His pulse never really slowed. It moved from frantic to tight, sitting high in his chest as the day wore on. He forced himself through chores, shook feed into troughs, checked fences, all the while glancing at the barn like a man expecting his own shadow to step out and talk. That night, he spread the manifest pages across the kitchen table. Columns of numbers, crate counts, signatures marched past his gaze. Lost, that ugly note, appeared beside entry after entry. In the margin, Panhandle transfer had been underlined twice. One sentence, half faded, kept snagging his attention. Rerouted per directive. Do not enter in standard log. He imagined uniforms leaning over that page, signing it, then glancing down a hallway to be sure no one watched. Whatever they had done, they had trusted distance and time to bury it. Now it sat in his closet. Jake gathered the sheets, slid them back into their folder, and shut off the light. Sometime past midnight, a pale rectangle appeared on the bedroom ceiling. He lay in the dark, watching it brighten and steady, more controlled than lightning, too white for moon. He swung his legs out of bed, padded to the window, and pulled the curtain 2 fingers' width aside. At the end of his dirt lane, where gravel met blacktop, 2 headlights hovered. They did not sweep or bounce. They sat there, perfectly centered on his driveway, carving a tunnel through the night and painting the mailbox in harsh glare. No engine sound reached the farmhouse. The beams held, cold and patient. Jake's grip tightened on the curtain. People did pull off the road sometimes, but they didn't usually park pointed straight at a stranger's porch at 2 in the morning and refuse to move. He counted under his breath up to 30, then again. The lights never shifted. Then, as if someone flipped a switch on the sky, they went dark. For several seconds, he saw only a smear of afterimage hanging in his vision. When it cleared, the lane was a darker stripe across the fields. If the truck rolled away, it did it without a sound he could catch. By dawn, he had argued himself into calling it coincidence, a lost driver. Kids. The story shrank in the daylight, but never quite left. Every distant motor rumble sent his eyes toward the road until the noise faded. Late that morning, he stepped into the barnyard and stopped. The powder dust around the Titan always showed his history. His own boots, drag marks from hoses, grooves where he had pulled cords. Today, crossing that script, lay a different line. A single track of boot prints circled the steam engine. The tread was sharp. Not his, not a pattern he knew. The steps paused by the ladder and at the welded seam. Edges of each impression stood tall, untouched by wind. He followed them with his eyes. They came from the open side of the barn, arced behind the Titan, and dissolved toward the back fence, where scrub thickened. No tire ruts in the yard, no cigarette butt, no stray glove. Just the fact that another set of eyes had stood where he stood now. Ray came to mind. His West Side neighbor had always been quick with a joke, the first to wander over when a new piece of iron appeared anywhere near. Ray had been at the auction, grinning when the Titan went for $1. Yet when Jake idled the four-wheeler along the fence that afternoon and waved, Ray did not stroll over with his usual loose stride. He walked up slower, cap low, eyes flicking once toward the barn, then away. "Seen that antique you dragged home?" Ray said, nodding at the distant shape. "Figure you're building a museum now, Wheeler?" "Cheapest lawn ornament I could find," Jake answered. Ray's mouth twitched. "Heard there was a truck sitting on the road last night. Lights aimed right at your mailbox. Wife woke me up. You expecting company?" The tone was casual. The look wasn't. "Nope," Jake said. "Probably somebody lost." "Yeah, maybe." Ray studied him a second, then let it drop, switching to feed prices. They parted with a nod that lacked their usual easy sarcasm. By evening, clouds smeared the horizon. Jake heated soup, ate leaning on the counter, and tried to pretend the day had been ordinary. The phone on the wall startled him when it rang. The jangle sounded too loud for the small kitchen. He wiped his hands and grabbed the receiver. "Wheeler Place," static answered. A soft hiss like wind caught in wire. "Hello?" he tried. "Who's there?" No reply. If there was breathing, it hid under the fuzz and the drum of his own pulse. "If this is a wrong number, now's your chance to hang up," he said. A clean click snapped in his ear. The line went silent. No apology, no tone, just absence. He lowered the receiver, returned it to the cradle, and stood listening to the house. The clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak as the wind touched the siding. Outside, night swallowed the yard, leaving only a hint of barn roof against the dim sky. Somewhere out by the road, a truck passed, headlights sweeping briefly over the fields, then fading. Bootprints in his dust, headlights watching his lane. A neighbor suddenly measuring his words. A call that rang once, confirmed he was home, then cut out. None of it proved anything. Put together, though, it felt like the first edge of a storm, building just beyond the horizon. Jake glanced down the hallway toward the bedroom, where a locked trunk sat behind coats that belonged to a life that no longer existed. The secret inside his tractor was not sleeping anymore. He switched off the light and stood by the window, watching his reflection fade until only the dark yard remained. The Liberty Titan crouched beside the barn, invisible but heavy as a thought. For years the world had walked past this farm without noticing him. Now it had turned, slowly, to look straight down his dusty road. He didn't yet know what he would do when it finally came walking up to his porch. He only knew the days when life kicked him, and he just took it were over. Whatever had been sealed in that machine had changed more than his balance sheet. It had drawn a line in the dirt, and sooner or later, someone else was going to step across it. And when they did, Jake Wheeler would not stand alone again. Laura Mendoza disappeared from Jake's world the same way she'd entered it, with a phone call that didn't last long enough. He had found her name 2 days after the headlights, searching online at the library computer in town because his own internet was gone with the last round of cutbacks. She was an investigative reporter out of Oklahoma City, the kind who dug into old cases, missing funds, veterans' claims that nobody wanted to hear. Her archive held a short piece on World War I war bonds that went astray on paper, but never turned up in vaults. The numbers on that article felt too close to the manifest in his closet to ignore. He'd stared at her contact information for a minute before dialing from a payphone outside the grocery store. When she answered, her voice carried the clipped patience of someone who'd heard every wild theory in the state. He started clumsy, talking about an old tractor, a hidden compartment, some records. She cut in, asking for dates, names, the exact wording of the stamps. As he recited the file lines from memory, the impatience dropped. Her tone sharpened, but in a different way. "Mr. Wheeler," she said quietly, "if what you're describing is real, then you're sitting on physical evidence of a federal theft the government pretended never happened. I need to see it. In person. Don't email copies. Don't mail anything. People have tried that before, and those packages never arrived." They agreed she'd drive up the next afternoon. It would take her 4 hours if traffic behaved. She told him to lock everything, to write down a list of every name on every page, and to be ready to answer questions he might not enjoy. Before hanging up, she added, almost as an afterthought, that if at any point his gut told him to walk away, she wouldn't blame him. "If you've ever had your life turned upside down by something you didn't ask for," she said, "you know this kind of decision leaves marks, but most people never get a shot at the truth. Think hard before you let this one go." Jake drove home, feeling something close to partnership rise in his chest for the first time since Ellen got sick. Someone else, someone who knew how to speak to power, was willing to shoulder part of the weight. He moved the trunk from the bedroom to the hall closet where he could watch it from the kitchen. He made coffee he didn't drink. He waited. Afternoon stretched thin. The sun crawled down the sky. A semi roared past on the highway. A pickup he didn't recognize slowed near the mailbox and then rolled on. By the time the light turned orange at the edge of his fields, the clock on the stove said she was an hour late. He told himself traffic around the city could do that. Accidents, detours. He washed dishes that didn't need washing just to keep his hands moving. When full dark settled, he called her number. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again an hour later, Then once more just after midnight. Same result. The next morning, regional news mentioned a single-car collision on a rural stretch of highway between the city and the Panhandle. A compact sedan had left the road, clipped a culvert, and rolled. The name of the driver had not been released, pending notification of next of kin. Jake stared at the scrolling text until the letters blurred. Compact. Highway. Late night. He shut off the television without waiting for the weather. By noon, the first black sedan rolled slowly past his lane. It was the kind of car that didn't belong on either of the two dirt roads that met at his mailbox. Polished, tinted windows, rental plates. It didn't stop, only drove by, turned around at the next intersection, and passed again. Later that day, a second sedan appeared. Different model, same color, same glass that showed nothing. One parked for a while at the far edge of his property, just beyond the posted signs, as if watching coyotes. Bootprints reappeared in the dust, deeper this time. More than one set. Jake started sleeping in his jeans, with the shotgun propped near the bed, though he knew in his bones that the kind of men who sent cars like that weren't afraid of old birdshot. 2 nights after the news report, he came in from the barn to find the hall closet door slightly ajar. He froze on the threshold. The lock on the trunk hung open, cleanly sliced. Inside, the stacks of gold bars sat exactly where he'd left them, canvas wraps undisturbed. The folder, however, lay flat and empty. Every page, every manifest, every letter, every photograph had vanished. No broken window, no kicked-in door. Whoever had walked through his house had done it with time, keys, and confidence. The message could not have been clearer. We can take what we want and leave what we choose. Jake sank onto the edge of the bed, hands hanging between his knees, breath coming shallow. The weight of the gold no longer felt like salvation. It felt like bait. They had left the metal behind as if to say, "Keep your shiny distraction. We care about the paper, we care about the trail, and we know exactly where you sleep." A fresh envelope waited in the mailbox that afternoon. No stamp, no postmark, just his name in block letters. Inside lay a single sheet from his own kitchen notepad, the kind Ellen had used for grocery lists. 3 lines in neat, unfamiliar handwriting read, "You have something that does not belong to you. Keep your mouth shut." Accidents happened fast this far from town. He stood by the box so long, the sun slid an inch across the sky. In the distance, a black sedan idled behind a screen of cottonwoods, only the glint of the windshield betraying it. His fingers wanted to tear the note to pieces. Instead, he folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. If they thought fear alone would finish the job, they didn't know how many nights he had already spent arguing with the ceiling for reasons to keep going. Back in the kitchen, he smoothed the wrinkled paper on the table beside the empty folder. His reflection wavered in the dark window. For a moment, he saw not a worn-out farmer on exhausted land, but a man standing at the edge of a story much bigger than himself. Maybe bigger than anyone left alive from 1919. If you've ever watched powerful people expect you to bow your head and move on, you know the burn that rises when they misjudge you. Jake felt that burn now, an ember stubbornly glowing beneath all the grief and dust. They had taken the trail. They had tried to erase one more voice. They were certain he would fold. He reached for the phone, with hands that didn't shake as much anymore, and began to dial a federal number Laura had insisted he write down twice. He wasn't a hero. He was just done being quiet. When Jake called the federal fraud tip line, He expected to be brushed off the moment he mentioned a rusted tractor and a hidden compartment. Instead, the agent on the other end had him spell every heading on the manifest, repeat the date 1919, and describe the welds inside the firebox. The moment Jake read the phrase panhandle transfer and the word lost written beside crate numbers, the man's tone changed. He took Jake's full name and address, told him not to move the bars or copy the papers, and warned him not to confront anyone who had been watching his road. "We'll come to you," he said. "Keep the doors locked and act like nothing's different." 2 days later, sedans rolled straight up the lane in daylight, gravel popping under their tires. The county sheriff's cruiser followed behind like an afterthought. Men and women in plain jackets stepped out, flashed badges, and moved through Jake's world with quiet precision. They photographed the Liberty Titan from every angle, measured the firebox cut, cast the fresh boot prints in his yard. Inside the house, they opened the trunk, weighed each bar, studied the stamps, and slid what remained of the War Department file into clear plastic sleeves. Even the anonymous threat from his mailbox went into an evidence bag. By sunset, strips of yellow tape fluttered around his barn and porch, marking off his life as a federal crime scene. Interviews followed in a borrowed conference room above the bank. Jake told the story so many times, it began to sound like it belonged to someone else. The auction, the wrong clang inside the firebox, the welded plate, the gold, the missing journalist, the black sedans. Each retelling took a little of the weight out of his chest and transferred it onto folders and tape recorders. On the fourth day, 2 senior agents and a government lawyer laid photocopies of his manifests and their own archival papers side by side. They explained that, in 1919, a shipment of federal gold had been rerouted under the excuse of national security, siphoned off the books, and marked lost in a maze of memos. Auditors had chased the discrepancy for years, but with no physical evidence, the case had gone cold. What Jake found in the Titan matched the gap exactly. The serial ranges, weights, and destinations lined up. Someone had hidden stolen gold in a machine, bound for a remote farm, and trusted rust and distance to bury the trail. The lawyer's part was blunt. The bullion had never stopped belonging to the United States. By law, Jake could not keep the bars themselves, but there were statutes about the recovery of stolen federal property and rewards for private citizens whose evidence exposed fraud. Based on the value recovered and the risk he had already faced, the Department of Justice would recommend a payment. She turned a sheet toward him. The number $6,800,000 sat in clean black type. For a moment, all he heard was the hum of the fluorescent light and his own heartbeat. That figure had always floated above him on bills and hospital statements. Now it appeared on a page that carried his name in the credit column. He asked only one question. "Do I lose the farm?" "The land stays yours," one of the agents said. "We'll keep a temporary seal while we finish. Every lien, loan, and medical balance in your name will be cleared out of the reward first. What's left is yours to live on and rebuild with." It took months for the paperwork to catch up to the promise. When the yellow tape finally came down, Jake walked his fields and felt, for the first time in years, that the ground under his boots wasn't about to be pulled away. The bank released its claim on the house. The hospital sent a zeroed-out statement with Ellen's name on it. He replaced the leaking roof with bright new metal, drilled a fresh well, and watched a new irrigation pivot swing over the fields like the arm of a clock. A modest, brand-new tractor arrived on a flatbed one clear morning, paint so bright it looked almost wrong against the familiar dust. The government offered to haul the Liberty Titan to a museum in the city, to park it on polished floors and explain it under glass. Jake thought about it, then shook his head. That machine had hidden the theft, but it had also sat beside his barn through droughts, storms, and the worst nights of his life. It had finally given up its secret here, not under fluorescent lights. If it was going to stand as a warning, he wanted it to stand on the same dirt that had kept the story buried for 100 years. So crews came back with welding rigs and concrete instead of evidence kits. They stabilized the frame, poured a low pad beneath the wheels, and fixed a small bronze plaque into a stone at the front wheel. It read, "Liberty Steam Tractor, 1919, used to hide stolen federal gold. Discovered here by Jacob Wheeler, 2024 some secrets. Rust, but they don't disappear." School buses began to appear now and then, raising yellow dust along his lane. Children tumbled out, stared up at the giant iron wheels, and listened while teachers told a softer version of the tale. A widowed farmer, a $1 tractor, and a choice to tell the truth when keeping quiet would have been easier. Old ranchers drove in on Sundays, stood with their hands on the warm metal, and nodded at Jake without needing to say much at all. Inside the farmhouse, life flowed back into rooms that had gone hollow. Ellen's apron stayed on its hook, but now it watched over a kitchen that smelled again of coffee, bread, and the occasional burnt experiment. Jake set aside a slice of his reward in a fund with her name on it. Small scholarships for kids from the Panhandle who wanted to study agriculture, nursing, or anything else that kept hard places alive. Letters of thanks began arriving in the same mailbox that once spat out foreclosure threats. He kept those envelopes in the drawer where past due notices used to sit. Some evenings, when the sun slid down behind green rows and fireflies started stitching light over the ditches, Jake would sit on the porch with a mug and look at the dark outline of the Titan. He knew he hadn't been saved by luck alone. A choice had stood between him and a different ending the day he cut that welded wall. Sell the gold, hide the papers, pretend he'd found nothing, or call and live with whatever came. He had picked the hard road. It had brought strangers with badges and threats, but it had also brought justice to a theft older than his farm and a future that didn't hang by a single dry season. Out by the barn, a rusted giant sat under a wide, honest sky, proof that some secrets don't stay buried forever, and that sometimes, when you drag the past into the light, it finally starts to pay back what it stole. By late summer, the story of the $1 tractor had already made its way through coffee shops and sale barns across the Panhandle. Folks drove out on weekends just to take pictures beside the Liberty Titan, kids climbing the concrete pad while their parents read the bronze plaque aloud. The farm looked different now. Pivots sweeping green circles across fields that had been cracked clay a year before, fresh paint on the house, a dog with too much energy racing the four-wheeler down the lane. Yet some evenings still felt the same as they always had. Quiet, the sky so big it made every decision seem important at the same time. One of those evenings, when the heat finally let go and the first cool wind of September slipped across the land, Jake found a thicker envelope waiting in the mailbox. Foreign stamps, blue and unfamiliar, crowded the corner. His name and address sat in careful ink, tilted a little, like the hand belonged to somebody who had learned English from books instead of road signs. There was no return address, only a town he didn't recognize, and the word Belgium tucked under it. He carried it inside, set it on the table, and stared for a full minute before breaking the seal. The paper inside smelled faintly of dust and leather. The letter was written in neat, deliberate lines, the grammar formal, but the emotion bleeding through every sentence. The writer introduced himself as the grandson of a captain who had served in the American Expeditionary Forces in 1919. On loan from a European bank to oversee transport of gold reserves after the war, that captain's diary, the letter explained, had been passed down through the family like a guilty heirloom. In it, he confessed that some of his fellow officers had diverted part of the shipment, convincing him to sign off on the rerouted crates with promises that the metal would fund necessary operations and that no one would ever know. Within months, he had realized the theft for what it was. He had tried to report it, been buried under paperwork, and eventually ended up discharged and sent home in disgrace. For decades, the old man had woken from dreams about a steam tractor rolling out toward a flat horizon, a secret welded into its bones. He had never found the courage to expose the crime, afraid his grandchildren would carry the stain. Instead, he wrote everything down and made his son promise that, if the truth ever came out, their family would acknowledge it. When news finally reached Europe about a farmer in Oklahoma who had discovered hidden bullion and manifests in the belly of a Liberty Titan, the grandson understood what had haunted his grandfather's nightmares. "I cannot undo what he signed," the letter said, "and I cannot ask forgiveness for men who are long dead, but I can thank you for doing what he could not. You have given rest to a story that sat on his shoulders until the day he died." At the bottom, in smaller script, came one more line. "My grandfather always said, 'The land remembers.' Now I see that sometimes it remembers long enough for justice to find its way home." Jake read the letter twice, then a third time with his thumb pressed against the edge of the paper. For a moment, the kitchen seemed to widen, stretching beyond his fence lines, connecting his small square of dirt to ships, rail cars, and decisions made in rooms lined with maps. The choice he'd made in front of that welded wall had rippled all the way to another continent, into a family that had been carrying its own shame. That evening, he walked out to the Titan with the letter folded in his pocket. The sun was sinking behind the pivot, painting the sprinklers and the steam engine in copper light. Fireflies had begun to blink in the weeds along the ditch, tiny lamps rising and falling in slow arcs. The plaque on the stone at the front wheel caught the last rays, the words, "Some secrets rust, but they don't disappear," glowing for a heartbeat before the light slid away. He laid his palm on the cool metal of the boiler, feeling the roughness of old rust under his fingertips and the smoother patches where so many hands had touched it since the crews set the pad. Somewhere inside that deaf iron shell, heat and smoke had once rushed around stolen gold. For a century after, only spiders and dust had lived there. Now it held only stories. "I guess you were carrying more than one man's burden," he murmured, voice low enough that only the wind and the insects could hear. "Not bad for something they all said was scrap." Crickets answered from the grass. A pickup hummed past on the highway and quickly faded. Above him, stars started to punch through the blue. Jake stood there a long time, feeling the old weight in his chest, not as ache or fear, but as a kind of solid, quiet dignity. The world hadn't turned him into a different person. It had simply given him a chance to be the version of himself Ellen always believed in. He thought about the people watching this story now through screens, folks in apartments far from any field, drivers on breaks in gas station parking lots, and farmers stacking their own unpayable bills on kitchen tables. People who really knew what it felt like to be kicked when they were already down, to be ignored by the powerful, to be told their lives were too small to matter. If you've ever felt like nobody would believe you even if you did the right thing, he said softly, almost as if narrating his own life, you know what this fight tastes like. A firefly drifted up, hovered between his hand and the plaque, and then floated away. Jake smiled, a small, tired, genuine curve. He stepped back, taking in the whole machine, the concrete, the farm beyond. In the distance, sprinklers whispered over green rows that shouldn't have been possible a year before. Then he turned and walked toward the porch, where an old chair waited and a new evening was beginning. Behind him, the Titan loomed against the dark, like a rusted guardian, watching over land that finally belonged to the man who had chosen truth over fear. If this story of a widowed farmer, a $1 tractor, and a century-old secret gave you even a spark of hope, don't let it die here. Hit that like button so more people see that not every buried thing stays buried. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next true legend that's been hiding in plain sight. And share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that doing the right thing can still change a life, even when it feels like the world has already written them off. Because out here, on dusty roads and in quiet kitchens, stories like this are still happening. And the more of us who hear them, the fewer secrets get to rust in the dark.